Hello, Plainview. Hope it's not as cold in your classroom as it is in ours. We're getting ready to start a fire in the middle of the room.
I made him turn up the heat.
I just went and turned it up in my room, but it probably won't be warm until the end of the class. Okay. What's the last thing in your notes? I cannot for the life of me remember where I wanted to start here. We talk about the beginning of the war already. Fought any battles yet? We talked about Abe Lincoln getting elected. Nobody can answer that question? Hey, out there, Plainview, what's the last thing you've got in your notes? Hang on for a minute, I gotta go get a cup of coffee anyway. Look to your notes, tell me where we left off. Yes, sir. Speak. Yes, ma'am. Somebody about to say something? Okay, hang on for a second. This thing's not functioning, right? Okay. Okay. Well, for those of you who were here and weren't taking an early Thanksgiving or anything, we actually got as far as talking about things happening in 1863. Let's go back and review just a little bit, and then I'll start putting slides and things like that up again. Abraham Lincoln was elected. The very first state to seceded in December of 1860. Other states followed, 6 other states followed in between December and February of 1861. By the time Lincoln got into office, a new country had been formed called the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. President Jefferson Davis. Lincoln was still trying to keep the Union together. Fort Sumter, though, was fired upon in April of 1861, and the war's pretty much already started by that time. Lincoln's called up troops. The first time he called up just about 40,000, then he called up another 70,000. After Fort Sumter, he's going to call up many more. Mainly these troops are coming from state militias. They start out being for just a short enlistment, but as the war progresses, they're going to be, for the duration of the war, at least 3 years, I think, was the shortest enlistment. After the taking of Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the Union forces are going to begin using the Navy to blockade southern ports. That's really going to hurt the South, and the South is going to try and counteract the blockade by bringing out an ironclad ship. But the fight that ironclad ship wages against a northern ironclad ship is going to turn out to be rather inconclusive. Both of the ships are damaged, and all it really tells us is that the South was really worried about being blockaded. The Southern strategy, the whole idea was just to hold out until the North got tired of fighting, and then the North would probably negotiate an end to the war. The South also felt pretty confident that the leadership of France and Britain would come to their help, at least in negotiating, if not military aid. The North, on the other hand, had this big plan that was drawn up by Winfield Scott to dominate the South by blockading their ports, all on the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and also by taking the Navy and dominating the Mississippi River to cut the South into pieces, and then to subdivide the South into smaller pieces and capture Richmond, the capital of the South. Two major sectors in the war. The eastern sector was more or less between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. That's only about 90 miles as the crow flies, if a crow were interested in flying there. Out on the western side of things, it's basically along the Mississippi River all the way from Illinois all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Early on in the war, the Union's going to be very successful in doing things along the coastline. They're going to seize New Orleans early in 1862 and begin an effort to dominate that river. Early battles, the first big battle was the Battle of Manassas. That was inconclusive. The Northern Army ran from the field after some fighting. Casualties weren't particularly high compared to other battles in the Civil War, but they shocked people on both sides. And the thing that the battle of, what we call the Battle of Bull Run or the Battle of Manassas, what that did was showed people that the war was going to last for a while, and it was going to be very, very difficult to serve. It wasn't going to be an easy thing. Up until that battle, people thought that maybe the war would be over in one day. One army would beat the other army, and that just wasn't going to happen. The Northern Army near Washington, D.C. was called the Army of the Potomac. The Southern Army over on that side was called the Army of Northern Virginia. It's going to go through several commanders, but by 1862, it's going to be under the command of Robert E. Lee. The Northern Army starts out under the command of a general by the name of McDowell. After the first Battle of Bull Run, he's going to get badly defeated. He's going to get fired, He'll be replaced by a general by the name of McClellan, little short guy, but a really good organizer, good trainer, knew logistics, knew all of these things, but he wasn't a very aggressive fighter. He's gonna eventually annoy Abraham Lincoln to the point where he's gonna fire him and look for another general. Out in the west, there are naval forces way up on the Mississippi River up near Cairo, Illinois. Gunboats. Not very large ships or anything, but they have big guns on them. That's one thing that the Union has. Another thing, they're building their army out of different state militias. One of them, a big one, will be the Illinois State Militia. There's a former Army officer, I think he left the Army as a captain, had a little bit of a drinking problem, was in debt a lot. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. When the war started, he tried to get back into the Army, but the senior Army generals didn't want him. They thought he was an embarrassment to them. But eventually, he's going to become the military aide to the governor of Illinois, and he will work his way all the way up to being a colonel and then a brigadier general of volunteers. That's kind of where we're going to pick up this time. In the east, in the area between the capital and Richmond, Virginia, it was kind of a stalemate basically because the northern general in charge wouldn't advance towards the south. He was always getting ready but not quite going. So the main action was out west. And this fellow Grant is going to get his fighting started. Now, if you look up the Mississippi, let me see if I can get this thing to come up on the screen. If you look up the Mississippi River, there's tributaries. One of the big tributaries is the Ohio River. Another tributary of the Mississippi is the Tennessee River. The funny thing about those two rivers, the Tennessee River runs north, not south. So you get confused when you're talking about a guy going south, but he's going upstream. U.S. Grant is going to take a unit and capture a Confederate fort called Fort Henry. It's just barely inside the borders of Mississippi, of the state of Mississippi. He's going to have help from the Navy. Gunships, they're gunboats, not gunships, are going to pretty much reduce that fort to nothing. Besides that, it's flooded because the fort was situated on pretty low ground, and the river is going to flood it. He'll take Fort Henry really quickly. Then on the 16th of February, he's going to go over further to the east, march over to the east, and with an army of something under 20,000 men, he's going to take Fort Donelson. Now they were a fairly large military unit. There were 3 Southern generals there. 2 of them are going to skedaddle. One of them is going to stay and hold the fort. General Grant is going to capture Fort Donelson on the 16th of February. Now, back in Washington, a very important man has been watching all of this because he's really concerned about these different generals and the fact that they have a little trouble taking it to the enemy. So he's interested in what this strange guy Grant is doing out there. And when Grant takes Fort Donelson, he's going to promote him to the rank of Major General of the Volunteers. It's not the same thing as being a regular Major General, but more or less the same on the battlefield. As a Major General, he's going to get the assignment to go down to a place called Corinth, Mississippi, which is a railroad crossroads important to the South. and take that town. And what he's going to do is he's going to use paddle wheelers. You know what a paddle wheeler is, right? He's going to put his army on that, almost 50,000 men, a little bit under 50,000 men. They're going to go to a place called Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. They're going to land there. They're going to advance in the direction of Corinth. They will run into an army led by Albert Sidney Johnston. They're going to fight a tremendous battle near the ruins of an old church. Had a little sign in front of it that said Shiloh. That's right out of the Bible. So they call this the Battle of Shiloh. And it's a vicious battle. The most vicious battle fought so far in the Civil War. And the Union Army goes reeling back in the direction of the Tennessee River. They managed to prevent themselves from being driven into the river, but not by much when the sun went down. One of the problems Grant had was that a lot of Army officers didn't like being under his command, initially at least, because they thought he was this guy that did no good in the Army, and they didn't think they should be under his command, and how did he get promoted so easily, and how did he become a general, and he had political push, et cetera, et cetera. But after that one day of vicious fighting, he's going to get them under control. The following day, actually overnight, he gets reinforcements from the so-called Army of the Ohio. So now he's got almost 20,000 more men. He's going to have a grand total of somewhere really close to 70,000 men, and he is going to, the following day, drive the Confederates off the battlefield. And so more or less, he's won the Battle of Shiloh. The problem is, in the process of doing it, he's killed off a lot of people on his own side as well as the other side. And General Halleck and his immediate boss and some other people in Washington are calling for his head. They want to get rid of him because he got so many people killed. Except one guy, and that guy is probably the most important guy. It says, no, you can't fire him because he fights, as opposed to some of the other generals. So he gets kind of protection. So General Halleck, to get him out of the way, makes him his assistant, his deputy, not assistant. But that gives him a desk job, more or less, and he doesn't have any troops under his command anymore. General Halleck takes over, and he's going to take the city of Corinth. It's going to take him kind of almost just about a whole month to do that. He's being very cautious. Meanwhile, General Grant's back at headquarters stewing with nothing to do. And the man from above, after Corinth is captured, promotes General Halleck out of his job by making him the general overseeing all the army, and leaves General Grant in control in that area, which is what the president wanted to do. He's going to have the responsibility to go all the way down the Mississippi, clear it out, so in conjunction with the Union Navy, they can control that whole river. Remember, that's step 2 of their strategy for winning the war. Back east, not much good is happening, except that the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate force, is now under the control of a general by the name of Robert E. Lee. And General Lee and President Davis decide it would be a good idea to attack to the north and try and scare the people in the north so that they might bring a political end to the war. Put pressure on Washington. What he's going to do is circle around Washington, D.C. and scare Washington, D.C., but the idea is to go as far north as he can go. And he's going to get into Maryland. He's going to get up to a little town called Sharpsburg in Maryland. The Union Army under General McClellan is kind of working its way around Washington, D.C. to keep in between him and Washington, D.C. But they're not attacking him, much to Abraham Lincoln's annoyance. They're just there. At that point, Robert E. Lee, somebody in his staff, drops a big map, and it's got a picture of where all his units are and what their plans are. And this gets into the hands of General McClellan and his subordinates. Some of the junior generals are saying, okay, now we know where they are, let's go get them. And General McClellan's going, like that. And they almost have like a minor uprising under him. And finally he gets into motion and they attack Robert E. Lee. And the battle is called, in the north, it's named after a creek that runs through that area called Antietam Creek. So they call that the Battle of Antietam. The South calls it the Battle of Sharpsburg because it's near the little village of Sharpsburg. It's basically a bloody, inconclusive battle. More people are killed in that battle in one day than are killed in any single day engagement in the entire Civil War. Tremendous losses, even worse than the 2 days of Shiloh. At the end of it all, having suffered some fairly severe damage, Robert E. Lee is going to go back south. Because of his long supply line, it's too dangerous for him to get north and have the Union Army cut off his supply line behind him. So he moves back south. And because he moves back south and leaves the area, then General McClellan can claim, I won the battle, even though it was pretty much a tie, even though McClellan lost more men than Robert E. Lee lost. Something to remember all the way through this war is that the Union always has more soldiers to lose than the South does. The South's losses become irreplaceable after a while. At any rate, so General McClellan announces this glorious victory, which was really kind of a tie. And Abraham Lincoln says, congratulations on your victory. Abraham Lincoln's not stupid. He knows who lost the most people and all that. But he's very, very willing to call it a victory. Because the Union hasn't had any out-and-out victories yet. Shiloh was a big mess. And he needs a victory for a reason. He wanted to announce something about freeing the slaves. But he couldn't do that because it looked kind of stupid if the guy that was losing the war freed the slaves, because there's no way he can do it. He can't enforce it. So he needed a victory. And he's going to use this victory for his purposes, even if it's only kind of a strategic victory and the actual fight came out as a tie. He's under a lot of pressure. And one of the things that's happening, Horace Greeley, big-time newspaper guy, I'll put this up on the slide in a second. Who else? Some of the leading abolitionists. These people are all bombarding the president with letters, why haven't you freed the slaves yet? He can't afford to have people sniping at his backside while he's trying to fight this war. And finally, in August of 1862, he's going to answer Horace Greeley. He wrote this big open letter to the president called the Prayer of 20 Millions, calling for him to free the slaves right away to weaken the Confederacy. Lincoln's going to respond to Horace Greeley by saying, I would save the Union. He's stating his number one point. Greeley said, what's your policy? You must have a policy. You're the President of the United States. What's your policy? And the president comes back and answers him. He uses Greeley's own words and says, as to the policy that I, quote, seem to be pursuing, end quote, I've not meant to leave anyone in doubt. I would save the Union. If you stop and think about the common sense of what he's saying, free the slaves, fine, if there's a union that can do it. But if you don't have a country or any authority, you're not going to free any slaves. So he answered back, I would save the Union. He had another reason for not wanting to say anything about freeing the slaves. And that you can see on this map. It's those blue states, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland. They're all slave states. But they didn't leave the Union. And he doesn't want to do anything precipitous that's going to cause them to leave the Union. Because he's passing through those states on the way south. That could be a big problem for him, especially Missouri. So he wants to wait. Now, quietly, Lincoln has been writing letters, and some other people in his government have been writing letters to these states proposing different solutions, like free your slaves, we'll give you compensation for it, whatever, but do it on your own, not someone ordering you to do it. You do it. He's not having that much success, but he has to do that to hold together what he's got. Now, the Battle of Antietam, otherwise known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, on the 17th of September, that will give him a victory. And now, after talking to his cabinet about emancipating the slaves, the cabinet all said, you'd be crazy to do that. You haven't won the battle yet. And Lincoln agreed with that. He was a political genius. Now he's got his victory. He can call Antietam a victory. And he's going to make a speech warning everyone that he is about to free the slaves. And we'll call it the Emancipation Proclamation, and think about the wording of it. That's a painting of him telling his cabinet he's about to publish the Emancipation. On the 22nd of September, just a few days after Antietam, he warns that he will order the emancipation of all slaves in any state that did not end its rebellion against the Union by January the 1st, 1863. Think about the wording. Is he freeing the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware? No, they're not in rebellion. He's talking about only the slaves in the states that are in rebellion. Does he control those states? No. So how many slaves is he freeing? None. Well, wait a minute now. This guy's no fool. What's he doing? Why is he making this announcement? Well, one reason is he's trying to get Horace Greeley and guys like William Lloyd Garrison off his back, at least for the time being. Two, maybe by doing this he can cause confusion in the South. But three, much more important, remember the Southern strategy. They were going to try and just drag the war out until the North wanted to quit. They were going to try and get England and France to come in on their side, at least as far as negotiating an end to the war, if not actually fighting on their side. But the thing about England and France, yes, the rulers of France and England talked about giving the South assistance. But the people of France and the people of England were strongly against slavery. And what the Emancipation Proclamation did, between the lines, you read a message in that emancipation. And the message is, this war is about ending slavery. Now, if you're the King of England or the Emperor of France, and all of your people are against slavery, it's probably not a good idea, if you want to keep on being the emperor or being the king, to give material assistance to people that want to prolong slavery. So basically what Abraham Lincoln has done is cut off any hope of the South getting help from England and France. And he knew what he was doing all along. So that's what the Emancipation Proclamation did. We'll have to get to the amendments to the Constitution before slavery is over with. There's a picture of Honest Abe in a tent with General McClellan. It's on the battlefield near Antietam, where the Union Army is still parked. And the president's been sending him little love notes saying, when are you going to go chase what's left of General Lee's army and wipe them out? And he keeps getting little answers, you know, like, we're short on supplies, we're resupplying ourselves, our men are resting up a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. Every week, you know, another excuse, but they're not going anywhere. So Lincoln actually rides out to the front. That's a picture of him sitting there in McClellan's tent, having a little face-to-face conversation about this. And McClellan tells him, okay, you know, I'm going, just a few days. So Lincoln goes back to Washington. This is the only president in our history after George Washington, and he wasn't president at the time, who's actually participated in detail in who's leading the army and what they're doing. So he goes back to Washington, and sure enough, McClellan's still sitting there, hasn't gone anywhere. So he starts sending him some more notes, and finally he just gets fed up with McClellan. McClellan's last excuse is, my horses are underfed, we're feeding them up, you know, we need them to pull our cannons and stuff like that. And Lincoln writes a little note to McClellan. I've read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the battle of Antietam to make them so tired? You can read that between the lines, right? Get off your butt and get moving, or else. Your else came on the 7th of November, 1862. He fires McClellan. He's going to hire another guy named Burnside. Burnside isn't much better. There's no way Lincoln can tell that until the guy's had a chance to prove himself. The year's not over with, and Burnside's going to try and do what Lincoln wants. He's going south, and he's going to go first to the city of Fredericksburg, which is on the road to Richmond. And he's going to run right into a really, really well-organized Southern defense, and they're going to wipe him out. They won't destroy the whole Union Army or anything of that nature, but they're going to soundly defeat him. He'll suffer twice the casualties the enemy has suffered. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. About 114,000 of his 122-man army, 2,000-man army, are going to be involved in this fight. 1,284 of them are killed. The Army of Northern Virginia loses 608 killed. You do the math. The Army of Northern Virginia wins this one. And Burnside reels backwards, goes into bivouac, into camp, and after that does pretty much nothing except walling around in the mud because it was a wet winter. The only thing that we remember Burnside for has nothing to do with the war. It has to do with his facial appearance. Somebody made a play on words, and we have a word in our vocabulary now that's in the dictionary. There's a play on his name. Facial hair on the side of your head is now called sideburns. That came from General Burnside. That's all we remember about him. That's more than enough. And of course, on the 1st of January, Emancipation Proclamation will be released officially. Burnside's going to get fired fairly early in January. And a more aggressive, at least hopefully more aggressive general by the name of Joseph Hooker will take over the Army of the Potomac. Robert E. Lee is still in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia. Another thing that's going to happen in March, we're going to start our nation's very first draft. Men between the ages of 20 and 45, with some exceptions and exemptions, are required to report for the draft. Didn't work very well. For the entirety of the war, we will draft about 162,000 men. Next battle Now Hooker is going to go after General Lee. I've got this map. This map is from a much later time in the war. But Hooker is going to work his way using the waterways here, the Rappahannock River, to move a large army and attack General Lee. General Lee, who's outnumbered, 100 and some odd thousand to 60 some odd thousand. Yeah, 133,000 to 60,000. That's pretty bad odds. He's going to split his army. That's even scarier. And he's going to bluff the Union Army to the point where they're defeated by one part of Lee's army under the control of General Stonewall Jackson. This is a disaster for the Union Army. They're going to pull way back across the Rappahannock and go nowhere. Sit there, watching Lee across the river. General Hooker's not long for his job either, but we'll get there when we get there. One of the fallouts from the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was Lee's greatest victory, was that Stonewall Jackson was killed during the battle. He was actually killed at night, just like the general at Shiloh was killed at night, inspecting his lines. The big significance of the Battle of Chancellorsville, once again, the South feels it's possible to attack into the North because of this major defeat they've inflicted on the Army of the Potomac. And so they're going to do that. They're going to head north. They're going to cross the Potomac at Harper's Ferry. They're going to move up through Maryland. They're going to even get their nose into Pennsylvania. Two reasons for going north. You might want to remember this. This is a good test question. The two reasons for Lee going north a second time. One was there was a city on the Mississippi that General Grant was trying to capture called Vicksburg, and it was the key to the Union controlling the whole Mississippi. They wanted to take the pressure off Vicksburg by drawing the Union back to the east. The other reason was they figured if they could get as far as, say, the city of Philadelphia, a large, important city, they would cause the entire North to panic, and maybe the North would be willing to negotiate an end to the war. It was favorable to what they wanted. And when he sets out, he's going to send his cavalry leader with most of the cavalry that the Army of Northern Virginia had. He's going to send him out on raids to upset the Union Army by trying to get in between the Union Army and Washington, D.C. They do that. And they make little attacks. But the problem with sending your cavalry away from you is that the cavalry are the eyes and ears of your army. If you want to know where the enemy is set up, you use your cavalry. Doesn't have helicopters or anything like that. And Jeb Stuart's being fairly successful, so he doesn't want to come back right away. In the meantime, Robert E. Lee, up near the town of Gettysburg, it's a little seminary town that's got like a religious school there and maybe just a small federal outpost. They're going to run into federal troops there. And Lee's going to stop because he's not sure what he's looking at. And he doesn't have his cavalry to go sniff around. He'll do some attacks from the north, actually, which will be moderately successful. But as each day goes by, the Union Army sends more and more people up there. General Hooker kind of loses it all mentally, and he's going to be relieved of his command and replaced by a general by the name of George Meade. Fort Meade's named after him. And he's going to start hustling Union Army forces up into this area of Gettysburg. And they're going to dig in. They're going to dig in along a ridge line and really fortify, dig trenches, the whole 9 yards. Now Lee has been waiting for Jeb Stuart to reappear, and he's not reappearing, so he's going to try and go around the Americans to the south, and that won't work. A couple of Union regiments from Maine and one other state, they're down on two little high pieces of ground called the Little Round Top and the Big Round Top, and they stop General Hood, one of Lee's generals, stop him dead in his tracks and turn him back. So Lee is in a quandary and finally decides he probably has more men than the Union Army does facing him, which was not true, and he's going to order a frontal attack. And in that frontal attack, he will lose incredible numbers of men. They're going to be caught in crossfires and fire from dug-in Union Army troops defending the high ground. It's a slaughter. And it will severely damage Lee's army. The U.S. Army, by the end of the battle, had a strength of about 93,000 men there. Lee had about 71,000, maybe 72,000. Lee's going to lose 4,708 killed, over 23,000 wounded in one way or another, another 5,000 captured. He's going to have to turn around and go south. Meade, on the other hand, is going to lose fewer killed, fewer wounded, about the same number of captured and missing. The ironic thing is that this, in part, was to take pressure off of Vicksburg. The Battle of Gettysburg ends on the 3rd day of July, and Vicksburg capitulates on the very same day, down south, out west. The story of Vicksburg is the story of Ulysses S. Grant going south along the Mississippi, splitting his forces, trying to surround Vicksburg. He fought a number of battles which caused the Southern Army that was down in this area to back away and to concentrate all their forces in the town, the fortified town of Vicksburg. Grant's not successful in capturing Vicksburg, and it suddenly dawns on him that the way to capture Vicksburg is not attack Vicksburg. The way to capture Vicksburg is to attack all the railroad junctions around Vicksburg, Jackson, Mississippi, and other places like that, to cut Vicksburg off from resupplies. They're going to block the Mississippi River, and after a 45-day siege, Vicksburg's going to have to surrender. And it just so happens it's roughly the same time that the Battle of Gettysburg is fought and lost by the South. These two battles, Vicksburg and Gettysburg, are the turning points in the Civil War. Even though the Civil War lasts on into 1865, from that point, the South is never able to take the strategic offensive. They're always going to be going backwards. They're always going to be on the defense. Two guys pay attention to. I know that General Grant paid attention to him. These guys helped him on the Mississippi River and also helped by capturing other locations. One is David Farragut. He captured New Orleans before the U.S. Army moved into it. Later on, in 1863, he will capture Mobile Bay and Mobile, Alabama. David Porter is going to fight with a squadron on the Mississippi River, helping Grant move his forces across the river, helping Grant maintain a siege of Vicksburg. These guys are foster brothers. David Porter's father adopted David Farragut as a foster son, And both of these two guys are going to be the first two admirals in the American Navy. We didn't have admirals before then. Old Ulysses S. Grant's star is in the ascendance. He got made a major general after taking Fort Donelson. Eventually, he's going to become a major general of the regular army. That's very significant. I don't know if you guys realize the military is like that, but a lot of times they'll promote a guy, but it's a temporary promotion, which has to be confirmed, and that usually happens maybe a year later or a few months later. In the case of Grant, he becomes a major general in the regular army, and then in October of 1863, he's put in control of the whole western area along the Mississippi River. Now, he doesn't have any trouble with getting his officers to listen to him anymore. In March of 1864, and I'm getting ahead of myself, we're going to go back to 63, but in March of 64, he becomes a lieutenant general. Very first lieutenant general in the United States Army since the only other man to hold the rank. Who's the only other man to hold the rank? George Washington. Then he'll become General-in-Chief of the Union Army. Eventually, he's going to have to go back east. But he's going to fight his army through Tennessee first. Now, going back to just after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, one thing that's going to vex the president, draft riots in New York City. Working class didn't want to have to go to the war. They didn't like it because rich men could buy their way out. And then it morphs into a race riot. The Irish Americans against the African Americans. The president's going to have to send several regiments of militia. Also going to have to send some naval units up there into New York Harbor to put this rioting down. Early on in Tennessee, we won some battles. We had what we call the Chattanooga Campaign. I'm trying to remember the name of the, hang on for a minute, I don't have their names on here, on the other slide. The name of the American general who didn't do so well. He ended up taking refuge in Chattanooga, and Braxton Bragg and the Confederate Army had him more or less surrounded until Ulysses S. Grant showed up and took command of everything. He's going to start maneuvering his armies around to go around the sides of Braxton Bragg. If you go around their sides and look like you're going to get behind them, they're going to have to back up. They get dug in on a really high ridge line, very, very steep set of hills called Missionary Ridge. Grant is in front of Missionary Ridge, in between Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge. He's got three pretty big armies. He's going to direct the army in the center to go to the foot of Missionary Ridge and act like they're going to go up the ridge. There's Confederate fighting positions at the base of the ridge. So it tells General by the name of George Thomas, go up there and take those positions and stop. By doing that, you will cause the Confederates to worry about defending from your direction, and then we'll have General Sherman come in from the side along the ridge line and force them to retreat. Sherman got hung up because he went up one hill he thought was on the ridge, and when he got to the end of the hill, he found out he had to go across another valley and up another hill to get to the ridge. But it didn't matter because General Thomas's troops took all of the little positions at the baseline of the ridge, and the rebels ran up the hillside to get away from them, and they decided to chase the rebels. And so General Thomas's whole army, not under any orders from anybody, they just went up a 45-degree slope, overran the positions of the Southern Army, who had to skedaddle, and they kept on going almost till they got to Georgia. So that took care of Tennessee. Following that battle, Chattanooga, Tennessee will become a big supply base for the Union Army. Grant's going to Washington to control the whole Union Army, and he'll leave behind him William Tecumseh Sherman to continue fighting the battle across Tennessee into Georgia. There, you know, if your interest is the Battle of Missionary Ridge, the battles of Chattanooga. By the way, Joe Hooker, the guy that got fired from being the head of the Army of the Potomac, is now over there fighting in Grant's army and doing a good job. He just couldn't handle that giant army. In November of 1863, President Lincoln is going to go to Gettysburg to the battlefield and make one of his most eloquent and famous speeches. It was actually kind of a second speech. The main speech was given by another speaker, a member of Congress, and Lincoln scribbled kind of an impromptu speech on something. I think maybe his scribbled copy of it may be in the Smithsonian. I can't remember if we have it or not. But you all probably know this speech or have heard it 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, etc., conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It goes on, not very many words for a speech. It's not a 5-minute speech or anything like that even. And it concludes, we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. There were literally thousands of dead men on or under the sod on that field. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's now engraved on his memorial in Washington, D.C., along with a couple of other speeches. Sherman's going to start marching into Georgia. He won't get into Atlanta or the area of Atlanta, Georgia until July of 1864. He'll finish taking control of Atlanta in September of 1864. Eventually, of course, he's going to march all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, but he hasn't even got permission to do that yet. Lincoln's thinking about several things. First of all, in 1864, he's going to have to run for re-election. So he wants the war to be over in case he doesn't get re-elected. He wants to finish the war before he's out of office. He's always got in mind, how do we get the southern states back in the Union with the least possible fuss? And he comes up with what he calls the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. That's probably the word where we talk about the Reconstruction period. That's probably where it came from. Other people call it the 10% plan. Don't write a whole lot of details about it, but basically it offered people to get their citizenship back, to reform their state, as long as they took an oath of allegiance and agreed to accept emancipation of the slaves. And they could begin becoming a state again if 10% of the voters did this. Only 10% of the voters had to do this. They could start working towards becoming a state again. And he would only punish, by not giving them their citizenship back, the senior leaders of the Southern Army and the Southern government. Everybody else had a free run. This people started calling the 10% plan. Now the hardliners amongst the Republicans didn't like that. They wanted to punish the South. They wanted to get rid of the plantation society and all that stuff. They're going to come up with a much more rigid and punishing plan. They call it the Wade-Davis bill. It will come up in July of 1864. Sponsored by Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Representative Henry Winter Davis of Maryland. This bill is so rigid that it's going to take at least another generation before the states can get back into the Union. Because they require 50% of the population of any given state to swear that it's loyal to the Union, one, and has never done anything against the Union, two, which already makes it impossible for most of the adult males to take that oath. It's called an ironclad oath. They want a total transformation of society. Get rid of the planter class, get rid of all of that. And they want votes and full rights of citizenships for freed slaves and other persons of color. Now, just before this was drafted, and by the way, this is going to be passed by the House of Representatives and by the Senate. Lincoln doesn't like it, and they made a strategic error. I don't know if they did it on purpose or not. They passed it about 4 days before Congress was due to go on its recess. And any bill which is on the President's desk, normally, if he didn't sign it after 10 days, it would become law anyway. But Congress has to be in session. If no one signed it and it's not law, and Congress goes out of session before 10 days pass, it just disappears. They call that a pocket veto. It's one way for it to disappear without the President having to try and veto it. That's what happened to the Wade-Davis bill. Now, not too long before that, that's July, in April 1864, the Senate of the United States passed the 13th Amendment, a draft of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and the wording read, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." It's going to take a while for the House of Representatives to approve this so that it becomes law. That won't happen until December of 1865. The election of 1864 will pit Abraham Lincoln against the general he fired, one of the generals he fired, General George McClellan. McClellan runs as a war Democrat, but he wants to negotiate the end of the war. Lincoln runs not as a Republican, he reorganizes his party to try and get elected. He calls it the National Union Party. And they don't renominate Hannibal Hamlin as vice president. They choose a war Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, former senator, before that congressman, to widen their base for the fall election. Lincoln's also thinking about rebuilding the South. And Johnson has already rebuilt Tennessee, which is already back in the Union. Hannibal Hamlin, on the other hand, was what we call a radical Republican. What do I mean by that? The hardliners, like the Wade-Davis bill guys. And Lincoln didn't want that. Lincoln's still not sure he's going to get elected, but he gets a little bit of help. Because in August of 1864 is when Admiral Farragut captures Mobile, and in September of 1864 is when Sherman captures Atlanta. And that raises Lincoln's numbers quite a bit. He'll get 212 electoral votes, 2.2 million popular votes, 55% of the vote. McClellan will get 21 electoral votes. There's McClellan and his party. Lincoln's second inauguration has one of the most eloquent speeches he ever wrote, and that's another speech that's carved in stone at his memorial. Starts out, he's talking about putting the Union back together. He's talking about let's not have any vengeance or any of that. What he called bloody work when he was talking in private. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with the firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in. Bind up the nation's wounds, care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Now the fighting is pretty much concentrated in the east. General Meade leading the Army of the Potomac, with General Grant staring right over his shoulder in case Meade needs to be pushed on a little bit. And Robert E. Lee consistently moving backwards, trying to protect Richmond, trying to slow down the advance of the Union Army, but there's really no chance. There's really no way to do it. The overland to Richmond campaign lasts all the way through 1864. Some of the things Congress is going to do, one is they're going to pass a new law that makes it possible. If you have a big company and you don't have enough workers, you can bring them in en masse. You can bring in a whole bunch of them under contract to work for you. It's kind of like indentured servants. That law will last for about 10 years. We need more people. Lee keeps moving backwards. His force is getting smaller and smaller. Supplies are bad. A lot of his soldiers are barefoot. A number of battles are going to be fought. They bypass Richmond. The Union Army is going to besiege Petersburg, because Petersburg is the railroad junction where all the supplies come from to feed Richmond and what's left of the South. A lot of major battles that we don't really have time to talk about. The Battle of Petersburg is one example where they use underground tunnels and gunpowder to blow up the Union lines, but it backfires because the Union generals aren't real smart about how they exploit the blown up lines. But Lee's always moving backwards. They'll fight, there'll be a pretty bad battle. If Grant doesn't win outright, what he does is he slides off to one side, like he's going to go around behind Lee, and that forces Lee to back up. And he keeps slamming into his lines and sliding off to one side to the other, and slamming into his lines again. He loses a lot of men. A lot of people to this day, especially people inclined not to like him, especially people from the South, say he was a butcher because of how many of his own men he killed. But what he was doing was, he was doing the required job. And there was no other way to do it. On the 31st of January, 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. It won't be ratified by all the states until the end of the year. Also in 1865 in March, a law is going to be passed establishing a Freedmen's Bureau. It was set up to deal with the problem they were starting to have. A lot of slaves had been freed as the Union Army moves forward. How to feed them, what to do with them. It was intended to aid them through legal problems, food problems, housing, etc. It's under the control of the Department of War, intended to last for 1 year after the end of the war. The president asked Frederick Douglass to run the Freedmen's Bureau. He refused. Eventually, it's going to be run by Union Army General O.O. Howard. He's a one-armed guy. He'll keep it going in between 1865 until 1872. On the 9th of April, 1865, after exchanging messages between them, several messages, Robert E. Lee, Grant says, "I'll accept your surrender at a place of your choosing." Robert E. Lee says, "I'll meet you at Appomattox Courthouse." Actually, it's a private home they meet at on the 9th of April, 1865. Once again, Grant allows the enemy combatants to take their sidearms home with them, and also allows them to take their horses with them. Figures they'll need them if they're farming or whatever. Now, Robert E. Lee's war is over. He and his men are all prisoners of war. But pretty quickly, the entire Confederacy is going to retire. I'm looking for the, goes like this. Army of Northern Virginia, that's Lee, and on the 9th of April, St. John Richardson's troops, Liddell's troops are going to surrender the same day. Mosby's Raiders on the 21st of April. Joseph E. Johnston, the guy that was leading the largest army other than Lee's army, is going to surrender on April the 26th. The Confederate departments of Alabama, Mississippi, East Louisiana are all going to surrender in early May. Down along the Gulf Coast in May, early May. President Jefferson Davis will be captured, wearing women's clothes, by the way, trying to get away in disguise, on May the 10th. The Confederate Department of Florida and South Georgia will surrender on May the 10th. Other forces surrender through May. The last southern entity to surrender was the CSS Shenandoah, a southern ironclad ship, which sails into port in November. But by the end of May, the war is over, pretty much without any question. That's Walt Whitman, the guy that wrote a nice poem about John Brown. Writes this poem: "Captain, oh my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting. While follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh, heart, 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 oh, the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead." Who's he talking about? Who's the captain who dies? The captain of the ship of state. On the 14th of April, 1865, an actor who knows his way around the Ford Theater slips into the President of the United States box, shoots the President in the head, stabs a military officer who's sitting with the President, and Abraham Lincoln will die the following morning, having never regained consciousness. There's the guy that killed him, John Wilkes Booth. There is the funeral train that takes Abraham Lincoln's body back to Illinois. And a newspaper offering $100,000 for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrators of the plot to kill the president. The city was in an uproar. The first guy to kind of take charge was the Secretary of State, Seward, and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, because he's in control of the military. But eventually, Andrew Johnson will become the President of the United States. And there you have 4 of the conspirators hanging around together at Fort Meade, across the water from Washington, D.C., at Fort McNair, not Fort Meade. Mary Surratt, Louis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. Mary Surratt being hanged was very, very unusual, but not totally unknown in the United States, of hanging a woman. Lots of stories about her, at least 1 or 2 people in each class is doing a book about Mary Surratt, Surratt's role. Casualties of war. The Union Army, 110,000 men killed in action, 360,000 total dead. That's people who die later of their wounds and illnesses and things like that. The Southern Army, 93,000 killed, 260,000 total dead. Basically, the numbers add up to about 620,000 young men killed in this war. That's a horrendous death toll. Andrew Johnson becomes the 17th President of the United States. He will become the very first president to be impeached. How many other presidents have been impeached since Andrew Johnson? 1 came really close but didn't get impeached. 2 have been impeached. Neither one of them has been convicted. None has ever been convicted. The other 2 are William Jefferson Clinton and